Security pulled a black woman off the plane. Turns out she was the one who pulled $4 billion in funding and brought the entire airline to its knees. They didn't ask for her name. They didn't check her passport. They didn't even scan her boarding pass. All it took was a look. The kind of look that doesn't question facts but confirms prejudice. The gate agent didn't hesitate. He simply pressed a button, and within minutes, 2 uniformed security officers were moving in, their pace calm but absolute. "Ma'am, we'll need you to step aside." No explanation, no apology, just that subtle condescension soaked into every syllable. Elena Moore didn't argue. She didn't even blink. She moved to the side as instructed, her steps deliberate, her expression unreadable, her silence louder than any protest could have been. Around her, a sea of designer luggage and first-class arrogance flowed on uninterrupted. The man behind her, older, white, Bluetooth still flashing in one ear, barely flinched as he moved forward and handed off his boarding pass without a word. No one questioned him. No one looked twice. Elena stood still, her canvas tote hanging from her shoulder, her clothes simple, navy pullover, worn jeans, sneakers with frayed laces. Nothing about her said luxury. Nothing about her screamed privilege. But the pass in her digital wallet didn't lie. Seat 1A, priority boarding, executive level clearance. And yet, here she was, pulled aside, uninvited, undesired, unexplained. The gate agent, name tag half hidden under a lanyard full of faux charm, glanced at her as though she had crashed a private gathering. "Just a random screening, nothing personal," he said without conviction. Behind his eyes was the kind of learned behavior you don't teach in training modules. Assumption, judgment, discomfort masked as duty. Elena said nothing. She let them lead. Through the terminal, past the whispers, under the glances that didn't ask what happened but quietly concluded it was deserved. She'd seen it before, had it memorized. The pattern always repeated itself. First came doubt, then came dismissal, then came silence, but not hers. Theirs. Theirs was the silence of certainty, of systems running exactly as designed. Hers was the silence of calculation, not compliance. Calculation. She had learned long ago that sometimes power looks like stillness. Sometimes it wears no badge, flashes no title. Sometimes it just watches and waits. They stopped her at a side checkpoint. "Tote bag, ma'am." She handed it over without hesitation. The officer, a woman trying hard to be both official and polite, rifled through it. A paperback book, travel-sized hygiene items, a folder with a red string clasp, a sealed envelope. The officer paused. "What's this?" Elena met her gaze. "Private," she said calmly. The woman raised an eyebrow. "Legal documents?" Not exactly. There was a flicker of curiosity, but protocol had no time for curiosity. After a brief scan and an indifferent shrug, she was waved through. Elena took the bag, slung it over her shoulder, and kept walking. By the time she reached Gate B14, boarding for first class had already started. A small group gathered by the front rope. Suited men, luxury travelers, a couple in coordinated activewear whispering about spa reservations. Elena didn't stand with them. She took a seat off to the side, near the window, away from the crowd, but within view. She didn't pull out her phone, didn't scroll, didn't pretend to be busy. Instead, she rested the envelope in her lap. Her fingers didn't move, but her mind was tracking every interaction, every glance, every time someone's eyes skimmed past her like she was an anomaly in the system. At 6:03 a.m., her boarding group was called. She stood, approached, scanned her pass. The machine beeped. The agent paused, glanced at her, then back at the screen. Something about her presence unsettled him, though he couldn't explain why. He looked for a reason to ask questions, but found none. So he forced a smile. "Enjoy your flight, Ms. Moore." She walked past him without a word. In the cabin, rows of leather and brushed aluminum framed the path to her seat. As she reached the front, the lead attendant gave her a look. The kind that's not quite overt, but doesn't need to be. She was cataloged instantly. Wrong type of calm. Wrong face. Wrong story. Elena sat down in 1A, placed the envelope under the tray table, and buckled in. The man next to her glanced once. then looked away. She didn't mind. She wasn't here to be seen. From the moment she entered the terminal, every part of her experience had been defined not by policy, but by perception. She didn't look like she belonged. And that's exactly what she wanted. The illusion of anonymity was the perfect mask. Her role wasn't to be catered to. It was to observe, to listen, to collect. 12 hours earlier, she'd been in a different room with a different crowd. A glass-walled boardroom 37 floors above ground. She'd been handed the envelope by the firm's director of strategic operations. "You'll fly the route yourself," he'd said. "Don't announce who you are. We want to know how they treat people who don't look like they own half the sky." Elena hadn't asked questions. She didn't need to. This wasn't the first time she'd moved in shadows to test the surface. The seatbelt light chimed. The cabin doors sealed. A flight attendant leaned over from the aisle. "Would you like a hot towel, ma'am?" Her tone neutral, her face unreadable. Elena nodded once. The towel came, still warm. The same attendant moved down the row, offering wine and orange juice, but skipped Elena's row on the return pass. Small things, easily ignored, if you weren't paying attention. Elena was. In her world, silence had edges. It wasn't the absence of sound. It was the presence of choice. Every act of exclusion had a fingerprint. You just had to know where to look. The plane began its slow taxi toward the runway. Outside, the sky lightened in strips of gray and gold. Elena didn't look out the window. She was watching something else. The way the staff moved, the way passengers glanced without really seeing, the invisible network of assumptions guiding every interaction. The envelope under her table remained unopened. It didn't need to be opened yet. Not until the last mask slipped. Not until they showed her who they really were. And when that moment came, when the people around her decided who she was based solely on what she wasn't, that's when she would decide who they were. Not by reacting, but by remembering. Because Elena Moore didn't come to fly. She came to land. Elena didn't flinch when they stopped her again. This time, it was at the security checkpoint. Her boarding pass had the unmistakable TSA pre-check clearance, the digital code glowing green on the screen. It didn't matter. A guard looked her over, then nodded at a colleague. Random screening. The words came automatic, rehearsed, but she'd heard them too often to mistake them for coincidence. She stepped aside without a word. No eye roll, no raised voice, just a nod, almost imperceptible, and a quiet repositioning of her tote bag onto the metal table. The officer opened it with gloved hands, rifling through each item like he was hoping to find a reason to confirm his suspicion. A toothbrush, a notebook, a zippered pouch, her ID. Then his hand paused over the red string folder. And this? Elena looked him in the eye. Confidential. He turned it over slowly, as if trying to decode the weight it carried. Are you a lawyer? Not exactly, she said again. It was all she ever said. The officer gave a shrug that tried to mimic indifference, but his eyes held onto the folder a beat longer before he handed it back. You're clear. She took the tote and moved forward, eyes forward, back straight, breathing steady. Behind her, the next passengers, white pressed, loud, glided through untouched. No extra checks. No folder questions. Elena logged it. Not as a surprise. Just a data point. Another entry in a mental file she'd been building her entire life. At the gate, the situation didn't shift. The same quiet assumptions filled the air like static. The gate agent, a man barely 30, gave her a once-over that landed somewhere between confusion and doubt. She handed him her pass. He scanned it, glanced at the screen, then back at her. His mouth twitched like he wanted to ask her something, maybe if she was in the right line, maybe who bought the ticket, but said nothing. Instead, he gave her a slow nod. Have a nice flight, he muttered, already turning to the next in line. In the cabin, she moved to seat 1A. She placed her tote under the seat, adjusted her tray, sat back. The man beside her glanced once, as if to confirm she wasn't lost. She wasn't. She knew exactly where she was going. The flight attendants didn't ask if she wanted champagne, didn't offer her a newspaper. They moved past her like she wasn't entirely real. It wasn't overt. That's the trick of it. It was just casual dismissal. Polished, invisible, practiced. But Elena caught it all. noted who offered a smile, who withheld one, who poured generously, who asked twice, just never asked her. The lead attendant, Sloane, came down the aisle with that stiff, controlled energy of someone trained to look pleasant without actually being so. She paused beside Elena, gave a half-smile that fell apart on contact. "Good morning," she said flatly. "I'll need to confirm your seat." Elena handed her the pass. Sloane took it, glanced, handed it back. "Thank you." Her tone was clipped. She didn't move, just stood there for a moment longer than necessary. Then she turned to the man across the aisle. "Can I get you anything while we wait for takeoff?" He asked for sparkling water. She smiled, warm, genuine, and walked away to fetch it. Minutes later, Sloane returned. "Ma'am," she said, voice more formal now, "I'm going to ask you to relocate to another seat temporarily. There's a maintenance weight issue we're balancing in the cabin." Elena didn't answer right away. She looked at Sloane. She didn't look angry, didn't even look surprised, just observant, like she was being shown something she already suspected. "Where would you like me to move?" she asked. "To row 12, Sloane said. "It's still business class." Elena nodded once. "I'll move when the captain says there's a safety reason." Sloane blinked. The words weren't loud, but they landed with finality. "I'll check with the cabin manager," she said quickly, and left. The man beside her leaned slightly. "Everything okay?" She nodded. "Fine." Her voice was the same as always. Steady, even. The only thing different was her grip around the edge of her tote bag, fingers tightening for a second, then loosening again. She didn't move, didn't raise her voice, but the message had already been sent. She would not yield on suggestion, only on authority, and only if it was justified. Around her, the hum of the cabin rose. People stowing bags, quiet conversations, the polite hum of a flight preparing for routine. But for Elena, every breath, every exchange, every silence was loaded. Later, the hot towels came around again. Sloane skipped her. Again, this time not by accident. Elena watched it happen. The attendant smiled, offered a towel to the woman in 1B, reached across Elena as though she wasn't even in the row, then moved on. Elena didn't call her out, didn't flag her down. She just added it to the list. A pattern. Repetitive, predictable, quiet. The kind of pattern that folds in on itself until it becomes policy. Until no one questions why. Meal service started. "Would you prefer the chicken or the cod?" Sloane asked the man in 1B. He chose. She turned to Elena, less warmly. "And you?" "The cod," Elena answered without looking up. "Coming right up," Sloane said and walked off. The way she said it wasn't rude, but it wasn't neutral either. It was clinical, like checking off a box, not offering a choice. The food came lukewarm, the bread dry. Elena didn't eat much. When the tray was collected, a junior attendant took it. He hesitated. Didn't like the fish? She didn't reply, just gave him a polite look that didn't invite further questions. He nodded, took the tray, and moved on. She noted him too, not because he'd done something wrong, but because he had noticed. That mattered. As the flight settled, Elena shifted in her seat and checked the envelope in her tote. The seal was still unbroken. The red wax shimmered faintly under the overhead light. She didn't need to open it yet. But soon, someone would give her the reason. And when they did, she would be ready. Not with anger, but with facts, receipts, power, the kind that didn't need to explain itself. The kind that waited in silence and showed up only when it was undeniable. The cabin light dimmed. The aircraft cruised smoothly. But turbulence had already begun, on the ground, in the assumptions, in the systems that quietly decided who deserved to be seen and who didn't. And Elena Moore, seated in 1A, was about to break that system open from the inside. Not with volume, not with confrontation, but with the quiet certainty of someone who knew exactly what she carried in that envelope, and exactly what it was worth. The hallway to the private lounge wasn't designed for spectacle. No windows, no noise, just a stretch of dim lights and industrial carpet that led away from the public eye. Elena followed the security officer in silence, her tote still over her shoulder, the envelope tucked inside like a pressure point no one saw coming. They didn't cuff her. They didn't use force. That wasn't how these things worked when they wanted to keep optics clean. The language was all surface-level civility, courtesy screening, misunderstanding, thank you for your patience. But the subtext, always the subtext, screamed louder than protocol. She stepped into the operations holding room, a windowless office dressed up as a consultation space. A woman in a black blazer stood behind a desk with 2 monitors and a printer that hadn't been used all morning. The name tag said Turner. She didn't stand to greet Elena. She just glanced up, already calculating. Ms. Moore, she began, tone measured. There seems to have been a process miscommunication regarding your boarding. Elena didn't sit, didn't answer, just reached in her tote and pulled out the envelope. She placed it on the desk gently, keeping a hand over it. This is a disclosure packet, notarized and time-stamped. I suggest you read it before this conversation continues. Turner's eyebrows tightened, but she didn't move. Disclosure for what? Elena slid the folder forward, broke the red wax seal, and flipped open the first page. I'm the final signatory and compliance witness for Genesis Equity Partners. We control 42% of Havenport Air's pending merger shares. This envelope contains the binding clause that halts your deal if this interaction is found to be in violation of any equity protocol. Turner didn't speak. Not right away. Her eyes scanned the letterhead, the stamp, the signatures. She picked up the document with hands that had suddenly lost their steadiness. Is this? She began, then caught herself. This wasn't flagged in the manifest. Elena leaned slightly closer. I know. It wasn't meant to be. This was an anonymous audit submission. Turner blinked. Internal. External. Elena corrected. Commissioned by the parent board. The air in the room shifted. Not physically, but perceptibly. Turner sat down, her posture forced into stiffness. What are you requesting? Elena tapped the desk once, calm and direct. I want the full crew log of Flight 447. I want access to cabin audio between takeoff and landing. I want surveillance feeds from Gate B14, the TSA checkpoint, and the in-flight service route. I want time-stamped records of all interactions, especially those involving Seat 1A. And I want them now. Turner hesitated, then picked up the phone. She didn't argue, didn't ask why. She just said, we need immediate compliance retrieval. Full package. Clearance override code Sigma 9. She hung up. Elena remained standing. She didn't pace, didn't explain. Her silence wasn't a gap. It was a presence. Turner pulled up a terminal. Files began to load. Live feed links, staff manifests, audio logs, data fragments forming the shape of a larger truth. Within minutes, the shift reached deeper. The internal message chain lit up. Admin offices received pings. Flight crew schedules froze. Sloan Carter's name blinked red on the terminal. Status, under review. The gate agent who flagged Elena pulled into holding. The supervisor who waved it off, now in a conference call with corporate risk. Nobody shouted. That wasn't how panic looked here. Here was mouse clicks, frozen screens, people walking too fast but pretending not to. And at the center of it, Elena, still not raising her voice, still not justifying her presence, just letting the truth land. Turner opened a feed and dragged the timeline slider back. The security footage from the boarding gate flickered into motion. There was Elena, waiting quietly, showing her pass being stopped. Then Sloan skipping her for towel service. A whisper caught on crew mic frequency, audible now under audit settings. Thought she was lost. Probably standby. Seat 1A? You sure? Manager said keep an eye. Elena didn't need to react. The footage did it for her. Turner minimized the video, her jaw tight. Would you like to file a formal complaint? Elena raised her chin. No, I'm filing a formal evaluation. A knock at the door. Another admin entered with a folder and an earpiece blinking red. Ops just sent a batch pull. Real-time logs. Ethics wants escalation path traced. He handed Turner the folder. She scanned it, then looked up. This goes to corporate. Elena nodded. It already has. She turned her phone screen toward them. A secure app blinked green. I triggered relay when the second towel was skipped. Turner glanced at the interface, then away. She didn't need to ask how Elena had clearance for something like that. She already knew the answer. Not just access, authority. Another alert popped up on the screen. Sloan Carter, suspended. Supervisor Renner, pending ethics review. TSA checkpoint officer, flagged for profiling audit. No one shouted. No one protested. There was nothing to fight. The evidence wasn't anecdotal. It was digital. It was structured. And it wasn't going away. Elena stepped back, folded the envelope, and slid it into her tote again. I assume we're done here. Turner's mouth opened, then closed again. You're free to return to the terminal. No escort, Elena added. No optics. Understood. She walked to the door, paused, then turned. Next time your team wants to identify risk, I suggest you don't ignore the kind that wears silence like armor. Then she left. Not fast, not dramatic, just steady, the way storms pass after tearing something open. The first signal wasn't loud. It was a silent server ping. Then came the notifications. 1, then 5, then dozens. Admin-level terminals lit up across 3 floors. Real-time security sync initiated. Clearance override confirmed. Audit status escalated. Inside the control room, the operator's hand froze over the keyboard. We just got flagged by compliance relay, he said in his headset, voice low but sharp. Code Echo 12. Full staff behavior review. No one replied. They didn't have to. They all knew what that meant. Someone at the top had pulled the lever. And now no one was off limits. Down the hall, in operations, monitors blinked to life. Live cabin footage, gate surveillance, TSA checkpoint logs, voice channel backups. Every recorded moment of Flight 447 unspooled like evidence in a trial that had already started. Elena didn't return to her seat in the lounge. She didn't need to. She had already set the system in motion. Now it was watching itself. One feed showed the gate agent whispering into a colleague's ear after Elena walked away, probably booked by accident. Another clip caught Sloan skipping seat 1A with a tray of towels. Another one, less than 10 seconds long, captured a line of dialogue over a crew comms channel. Keep an eye on the one in front. Doesn't match the manifest tone. It wasn't just subtle bias anymore. It was documented behavior. Time-stamped, cross-referenced, archived. The system had done the heavy lifting. It recorded everything. But now, for the first time, someone was watching back. At 11:47 a.m., a compliance officer named Jennings entered the review suite holding a clipboard he hadn't written on. His eyes met Elena's briefly. They're running internal cross-checks, he said. Do you want live confirmation of each trigger, or just a summary? Elena didn't blink. Both. Jennings tapped a console. A series of files opened. Sloan Carter, skipped standard service protocols for seat 1A. Gate agent Eric Renner. Verbal notation suggesting misplaced identity. TSA Officer Daniels. Initiated secondary screening without cause despite pre-check clearance. Multiple entries, all matched to surveillance. They're reviewing communication logs now, Jennings added, adjusting his earpiece. Mic records show jokes, personal remarks. Some are not going to hold up under HR. He paused. Do you want to notify the ethics board or let the audit team handle it? Neither, Elena said. They're already notified. Jennings looked up. By who? Me, she said. 12 minutes ago, when I signed into the override app. He stared for a moment, then nodded. Understood. On screen, Sloan's badge lit up red. Administrative lock activated. A message appeared. Removed from flight rotation pending disciplinary review. The monitor shifted. A live feed from Terminal F showed Sloan standing outside an admin door, her expression tight, holding her logbook like a shield. She hadn't been told yet, but she would be. And when it hit, it wouldn't be in the form of blame. It would be in the form of truth. Not accusation. Evidence. The kind that didn't yell. It simply played back. At 12:05 p.m., the first formal suspension was logged. 2 more followed. Another agent, caught making a dismissive remark during the boarding process, was flagged for escalation training suspension. The video logs didn't care how many years of service someone had. They didn't care who smiled on camera or filed neat reports. They only cared about patterns. Patterns that now had names. Faces. Voices. Elena stood to the side, arms folded, watching it all play out like a trial she wasn't part of, because she didn't need to be. Her presence had already tipped the first domino. Everything after that was gravity. Jennings' voice dropped. This is bigger than we thought. Elena didn't respond. She was watching a different screen now, one showing a private Slack chat thread from GateOps. Someone had typed, "Did you see who they try to move from 1A? Hope she sues the hell out of them." Someone else had replied, "Too late. That lady's not just flying. She's watching." By the time the legal team from Havenport's parent company connected to the internal feed, 5 staffers were locked out of their logins. 3 were under emergency HR interviews, and 1, Sloan, was being escorted to a waiting room by a floor manager with a look that said this wasn't routine anymore. The compliance dashboard logged its own entries. Behavioral risk index exceeded. Human audit required. Triggered by external override. Elena turned away from the screens. She didn't need to see more. She already knew what it meant. This wasn't a revenge play. It wasn't about punishment. It was about proof. Systems like these weren't afraid of noise. They were built to ignore noise. What they weren't built for was silence that documented everything. Patterns that didn't shout, but recorded. Data that didn't react, but remembered. In the lounge, the notifications didn't stop. An alert flashed. Flight 447 review archived. Initiating cross-check with company-wide staff behavior analytics. Jennings wiped his face. "You've triggered a full-spectrum behavior audit." Elena nodded. "They'll thank me for it later." "You think they'll recover?" he asked. She looked at him for a long moment. "Only if they realize it wasn't a mistake. It was design." And then she walked out. The audit wasn't over, but her part was. Elena didn't say a word when the alert came through. The message blinked once on her screen. Merger confirmation deadline in 2 hours. Status, pending signature. She tapped it, hovered for a beat, and then hit defer. Not decline, not cancel, just not yet. A pause loud enough to ripple through markets that only understood movement. Within minutes, the ripple turned tidal. By the time Elena walked out of the terminal's north wing and into the waiting car, stock watchers had already begun posting in private finance forums. Why hasn't Havenport closed the deal? Why is Genesis holding the line? At first, it looked like a delay, a procedural hiccup, but then it kept going. 10 minutes, 20, a full hour. Enough time for doubt to compound interest. Across 3 time zones, board members started dialing phones. One headline surfaced, then 3 more. Who is Elena Moore? Whispers of audit at Havenport Air, shake merger, forecast Genesis equity, pulls leverage play. But Elena didn't issue a statement. She didn't grant interviews. She didn't post. She didn't even return messages from her own firm. Her silence wasn't absence. It was signal, and it hit louder than a press conference ever could. Inside the Geneva offices of Genesis, partners huddled behind glass. They argued about strategy, optics, investor confidence. But no one touched the signature authority field. Only one name was authorized. Only one hand could trigger execution. And she had gone quiet. Deliberately. Precisely. Entire divisions froze. PR teams drafted half responses, legal crafted denials that never made it past legal. Everyone waited. Elena didn't. In a quiet meeting room, far from public view, a junior advisor named Lamont tried to reach her. He paced, headset in one hand, fingers scrolling a message history for any clue. The last text she'd sent was 6 words. Wait for the dust to fall. He hadn't known what it meant at the time. Now he did. On the market floor, Havenport's ticker turned red. It wasn't a crash. It was erosion. A steady bleeding of trust in the deal, in the brand, in leadership. Brokers whispered. Analysts speculated. Rumors turned into theories. The media called it a confidence fracture. What it really was exposure. Exposure of a system built on assumptions, and one woman who no longer played by its script. Sloan Carter never spoke to Elena again. She was pulled from active duty within hours, sent home pending full review. Her employee portal access revoked, her clearance badge flagged. No hearing, no defense, just the quiet machinery of corporate self-protection kicking in. The difference this time? There was no scapegoat, no rewrite. The evidence sat in archives, embedded in server logs, captured in sync. It didn't accuse. It just existed, untouched, undeniable. Back at the terminal, Elena entered a private suite reserved for strategic partners, normally offered to billionaires, foreign dignitaries, and tech executives. The attendant who greeted her didn't ask for ID, didn't check her name. He had already been briefed. "Would you like to connect to our executive boardroom?" he asked. Elena shook her head. "Just a terminal." He nodded, stepped back, and opened access. Inside, she sat alone. No calls, no noise, just her, a screen, and time. An encrypted message slid across her interface. From the Genesis Director of Strategic Operations. "We need clarity. This delay will cost us 7 points by end of day." She read it, didn't reply. Another message followed. "Are you playing a position or sending a signal?" She didn't reply to that one either, because it wasn't a question. It was an answer trying to disguise itself. Later that evening, a cable business anchor used the words "controlled silence" to describe her move. What he didn't understand, and what made her dangerous, was that it wasn't about control. It was about consequence. Elena hadn't created chaos. She just stopped covering it up. She hadn't leaked anything. She hadn't spoken a word. All she'd done was pause, and the system exposed itself. Executives who'd once dismissed her now requested meetings. One tried to intercept her at the car. She looked at him once, expression unreadable, then stepped into the vehicle and shut the door. Another sent flowers. Another left a voicemail that began with "I think we got off on the wrong foot," and ended with "please call me." She didn't, because she didn't need to. By midnight, Genesis stock rebounded slightly, not because the deal was back on track, but because traders assumed it must be. Because no one believed a single woman could derail a billion-dollar merger by saying nothing. But they were wrong. Elena Moore hadn't said nothing. She just said enough. And now, everyone else was trying to fill in the rest.